The history of the European continent undoubtedly has plenty of stories of oppressed peoples resisting their subjugation. If you think about it, the Irish, the Basques, and the Baltic Forest Brothers probably come to mind, and rightfully so. Whether or not they ultimately succeeded, their unyielding struggle for freedom against all odds is truly heroic and well remembered. However, one of these was basically wiped out of societal conscience. An incident basically unknown outside of the belligerents' collective memories, or discarded as a footnote in history. A cultural genocide against 3 million people inhabiting 22,000 square kilometers of a land they settled for centuries, by a state that forcefully annexed them, the Sudete Germans. Most of the time, it's just the pretend for Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland and prelude to the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Even here in Germany, the event is rarely discussed outside of the groups of the descendants of the survivors. And in English media, essentially, there's no coverage of it at all. That's where I come in. In this video, I will explain what happened, who the Sudets are, how they resisted the Czechoslovak state, and how they were ultimately wiped out for the struggle. But before we begin, a quick disclaimer. I know that as a German, I'm kind of biased regarding this topic, at least subconsciously. Still, I try to give an rational and objective overview of the events in hope to give you a good insight into this rather undersearched topic. To better understand the rise of Czechoslovakia and conflict between Germans and Czechs, we first have to look at the history of the Czech national movement. Ever since the crowning of Maria Theresia, Vienna attempted centralization of the crown lands in the spirit of Enlightenment absolutism. This faced heavy opposition by the Bohemian and Moravian nobility, which even though already Germanized, had preserved a distinct cultural pride. Their resistance would give birth to the Czech nationalist movement in the 19th century. To the Czech mentality, the Habsburger rule since 1526 was a disastrous chain of events that drove Czechia's sons to near extinction. The general alignment of Austro-Hungarian diplomacy towards the Kaiserreich only accelerated the alienation of Bohemia's Slavic population. World War I then caused the ultimate breakup of the Czechs with the Danube monarchy. The war was the opportunity for the nationalists. If they played their cards right, an independent Czech nationalist state could be built out of the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But firstly, they needed international allies. It is here where the founding fathers of Czechoslovakia come into the scene, Edvard Beneš and Tomáš Masaryk. They defected in 1915 to London to advocate the idea of an independent Czechia in the UK and France. Following the establishment of the Committee for the Foundation of a Czechoslovak State in Paris the same year, and the Czechoslovak National Council in 1916, their work begins to be fruitful, when on 11th of August 1918, the US approved the Czechoslovak sovereignty. Their plan had succeeded. Early on in 1918, the Czech delegates increased the pressure on Kaiser Karl by proposing the Three Kings Declaration, which advocated for the self-determination of all Czech lands. On 28 October 1918, Austria-Hungary's downfall was complete. Kaiser Karl abdicated and Prague declared independence. A new chapter in Europe's history had begun. The following negotiations of Saint-Germain primarily aimed not at equal partition of the Austro-Hungarian Empire through the right of self-determination, but weakening of the German Empire and more indirectly a prevention of expanding Bolshevik influence. However, already emboldened by Wilson's promise, the various ethnic groups of the Crown lands aimed to create their own nations or joining the already existing ones. A task which realistically could have very well be achieved by local referendums. Yet especially in the case of Czechoslovakia, this was never applied. Especially the Germans and Hungarians grew to resent the new state for losing the historic chance of joining their regarding motherlands. In 1919, the Czechoslovak position was then strong enough, thanks to Beneš's careful planning of the war years, that their ambitions could surpass ethnic-based claims into historic ones. The claims were as followed: the historic lands of the Bohemian Crown, including Austrian Silesia, the Slovak parts of Hungary, and, for geographic reasons, corrections on the German border, mainly Serbia and German Silesia. The map proves that the Czech delegation went further than historic claims. Additionally, even the historically justified claims stood in stark contrast to the ethnic reality of these areas. But since the Entente, mainly France, was very eager to establish Czechoslovakia as a strong neighbor to Germany's flank, this was discarded. Furthermore, they agreed that Bohemia and Moravia had to be upholded as an economic entity, which is just a reframing of the fact that the Sudetenland's industrial capacities were far higher than these of the eastern counterparts of Slovakia and Ruthenia. Furthermore, the Czechs had done everything to downplay the ethnic reality in the region. Outside of Bohemia, there wouldn't be any Germans at all, and besides that, Czechs and Germans would mix for centuries. A lie which the crushingly negative rejection of these areas completely debunked. However, this would all be in vain. On 3rd December 1918, Czech troops invaded the German areas of Bohemia and Moravia. Sparsely overall, useless resistance of the remaining Volkswehr units followed. On the diplomatic side, it didn't look much better. The newly formed delegation under Dr. Karl Renner, in addition with the demand for sovereignty, proved just as effectiveless. However, from the Allied view, this was simply unthinkable. Diplomacy proved pointless. Renner's delegation wasn't even included in the ratification of Saint-Germain and merely could send written proposals. Facing reality, the Sudete independence movement quickly emancipated itself from the impotent forces of Vienna. Provoked by the Czech occupation, protests erupted in the area just to be bloodily crushed by Prague. 400 casualties followed. The new European order thus proved to be a hard blow for the German people. The German Empire lost vast territories of its sovereign area. The southern neighbor, Austria-Hungary, simply broke apart. The 3 million Sudetes especially harbored resentment after their grim fate imposed onto them. Prague didn't take any moves to improve the situation. While promising on the world stage that all attempts to emancipate the German population would be undertaken, Germans would have equal rights and German would be the second official language, no such measures were taken. Officially, it was promised to structure the new state like Switzerland. The fact that it had not been possible to join either Austria or Germany filled the overweight Germans with bitterness. Not a single German was involved in drafting the Czechoslovak constitution in 1920 due to a boycott. Moreover, the concept of the Czechoslovak nation was hardly suitable for giving the Sudeten Germans a sense of national participation. To the international community, it was assured that the new Czechoslovak state would do everything necessary to enable the German minority to live as equals in the Republic. Thus, the memoranda for the Peace Conference in 1920, in Memoir 3, Chapter 6, regarding the treatment of Germans, stated the following: the Germans in Bohemia would have the same rights as the Czechoslovaks. German language would become the second official language, and no repressive measures would ever be used against the German population. The regime would be similar to that of Switzerland. Officially, the willingness was declared to go even beyond the minority protection laws to accommodate Germany. These minority protection laws were eventually agreed upon in cooperation with the League of Nations in the form of a Minority Protection Treaty signed on September 10, 1919. However, the very promise to make German a second official language was never fulfilled. The Czechoslovak Minister of Defense, Václav Klaus, first introduced the comparison to the Swiss model into political discourse on January 2, 1919, as a way for Prague to deal with the emerging minorities. A few months later, on April 21, 1919, he went further by clearly contrasting his methodology with the previous Austrian Habsburg approach to ethnic compromise, which he labeled language barter. Already 2 years after drafting of the Czechoslovak constitution, Masaryk noticeably backtracked in his New Year's message, stating that the Swiss model did not correspond to the historical background of the state. In any case, such a model or something similar would have required that minorities identify with the new state, but this was completely lacking due to the founding history of the Czechoslovak Republic. Its borders had ultimately been enforced by violence and were cast into legally binding form through peace treaties that were negotiated entirely one-sidedly at the expense of the peoples now declared to be minorities. From the very beginning, the Prague government's efforts to foster loyalty among the minorities living in the state stood in contradiction to the principle of self-determination, the very principle that the Czechs and Slovaks had claimed for themselves and which had ultimately led to the creation of their common state. I have repeatedly used the term Sudeten Germans, although this designation is actually quite imprecise. It refers to very different German ethnic groups who are lumped together under this term. According to Professor Dr. Adolf Haufen, founder of the scientific ethnography of German Bohemia, many ethnic groups must be distinguished in German Bohemia and the Sudetenland. The Bohemian forest dwellers and South Bohemians, the Egerländers, the Upper Saxons, and the Silesians. These groups were aware of a common affiliation with the Germandom, but a shared identity as a supra-regional ethnic group had not emerged. So how did they come to be united as a single collective within the Czechoslovak Republic? After the collapse of Austria-Hungary following World War I, ideal conditions arose for political elements that had long supported a greater German solution and had seen the multi-ethnic Habsburg monarchy as an obstacle. The attempt to re-establish German hegemony in Central Europe through a pan-German state was suddenly very attractive in the eyes of many. And now, since even the attempt to unite with Austria failed, partly due to the lack of cohesion among the war-weary German population in these regions, there was really no other option left. To achieve these goals in the long term, unity among all Germans in Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia had to be established. This explains the emergence of yearbooks and political pamphlets appealing to the shared identity of the Sudeten Germans. These materials helped establish and politically charged term Sudetendeutscher. This development was also supported from abroad. German emigrants from Czechoslovakia, now living in Germany and Austria, contributed with their own publications and by organizing an international network to promote Sudeten German solidarity and by organizing an international network to promote Sudeten German solidarity. At first there was intense competition among the various regional associations, or Heimatbünde, but in 1928 they were consolidated into the Sudetendeutsche Heimatbund, Sudeten German Homeland Association. The aim was to build a solidarity network to improve economic conditions, and ultimately NLM participated in local elections from 1919 onward. The Sudeten German party system largely followed an Austrian model. Parties simply separated from their Vienna headquarters and founded local branches in German-speaking areas of the new nation, enable self-determination for the Sudeten Germans. This sense of belonging was further reinforced by the clumsy political decisions of the Prague government in handling the German minority. The various German groups increasingly saw themselves united in suffering. They were equally affected by discrimination and by the late 1920s, equally economically ruined. Once it became clear that unification with Germany and Austria was impossible under the current circumstances, German political representatives in Czechoslovakia accepted the situation, and this led to a fragmented party landscape. Until 1933, there were no mass parties. Even when German parties like the Christian Social People's Party, the DCV, and the Farmers League, BDL, joined the government in 1926, it brought no real change for German participation. Fearing for the stability of the young coalition government, they neglected the interests of their German voters and even supported a 1927 administrative reform which abolished existing districts and centralized control under Prague. This was aimed at preventing the formation of German-majority administrative units. As a result, support for German coalition parties declined. The German population now viewed compromise with Prague negatively. Radical parties like the DNSAP, German National Socialist Workers' Party, gained more votes. At the same time, a ban on the DNSAP became increasingly likely, since it opposed democracy and demanded Sudeten German autonomy, something deeply destabilizing. In late 1933, Hans Krebs, the founder of the DNSAP, sought to create a new political unification movement. He contacted Konrad Henlein, head of the German Gymnastics Association, DTV, who had gained much popularity after organizing a major gymnastics festival in July 1933 in Eger. An agreement wasn't reached at first, so Henlein decided to form his own party. He resigned from the DTV and on October 1st, 1933 launched the Sudetendeutsche Heimatfront, SHF, Sudeten German Homeland Front. The movement gained traction quickly, especially among young people who saw in the SHF a chance to participate politically. Although the party was internally divided, like its German counterpart, the NSDAP, between traditionalists and radicals, it managed to mobilize enormous voter support. 2 years after its founding, in 1935, the SHF caused a political earthquake. It became the major election winner among German parties in the Czechoslovak Republic. On May 19, 1935, a new parliament was elected. The Sudeten German Party, SDP, formerly the Sudeten German Homeland Front, SHF, almost wasn't allowed to run. Czech and German Social Democrats, Czech National Socialists, the Czech People's Party, and much of the Farmers League, BDL, demanded the party to dissolve. Eventually, the SDP was permitted to participate on one condition. It had to change its name. Thus, the Sudeten German Homeland Front, SHF, became the Sudeten German Party, SDP. The decision was not driven by moral concern, but by political calculation. Banning Henlein's movement risked pushing it underground, making it harder to control. Allowing it instead meant containing and eventually neutralizing it. In the election, the SDP won approximately 1,249,500 votes, around 63% of the German-speaking vote. This resounding victory gave Konrad Henlein the momentum he needed to transform the party into a mass movement. Prague had not anticipated such a landslide. How did Henlein succeed? The SDP reawakened old conflicts that moderate parties had tried to reconcile. These parties had accepted token positions and ministries from Prague in return for little real benefit. Sudeten Germans no longer wanted compromise. They demanded a firm embrace of their German identity. Heinlein capitalized on this sentiment, portraying his party as the voice of an oppressed minority deprived of its rightful status. The economic hardship in the Sudetenland, alongside Prague's lack of solutions, amplified this disillusionment. The SDP ran a grassroots campaign, reaching broader audiences including supporters of the dissolved DNSAP and disillusioned non-voters. Formally, the SDP still supported Czechoslovakia's democratic structure, but its emphasis on being the sole representative of Sudeten Germans revealed deep mistrust of Czechoslovak democracy. That mistrust stemmed from their experience under the guise of democracy. Prague had denied Sudeten Germans rights, hardened unjust conditions, and labeled legitimate resistance as illegal, even though Germans repeatedly encountered false claims of democratic fairness. The uprising of Sudeten Germans was thus framed as freedom-loving resistance to a false democracy. Their deep-seated discontent with the system, rooted in the country's creation and worsened by the 1930s economic crisis, found political expression in 1935. Prague's response, a strategy of repetitive punitive measures, backfired. It emboldened the SDP, which in turn drew young radicalized members, shifting direction. Meanwhile, in Nazi Germany, Hitler and the NSDAP had taken power 2 years earlier. They watched the SDP's growth with interest. The German Reich increasingly focused its foreign policy on the Sudeten German issue. By late 1930s, Hitler's influence intensified, channeling funds and moral support to Heinlein. On November 21, 1947, Heinlein declared the SDP a tool of National Socialist policy. The Anschluss in March 1938 changed everything. Suddenly, the Sudetenland bordered Germany directly, and the incorporation of Austria signaled to Sudeten Germans that reunion with the Reich was plausible. Heinlein's international tours, including London, were designed to draw attention to Sudeten German grievances and to expose Prague's propaganda. Meanwhile, Britain and France began to recognize that the Versailles system had failed Sudeten Germans and that incorporating them into Germany might ease tensions. Prague was isolated diplomatically and unprepared. Heinlein demanded more than Prague was willing to concede, and misreading the situation, treated negotiations like a diplomatic bluff. From September 13th to 16th, 1938, a revolt broke out in the Sudetenland. Encouraged by Hitler's speech at Nuremberg, Freikorps troops infiltrated the region, launching violent attacks on Czech institutions. Prague responded by banning the SDP, mobilizing its army, and occupying border areas. Heinlein fled to Germany on September 15, calling on his followers to return home to the Reich. At this point, Nazi Germany took control of the situation. The pressure from Hitler was so immense that Britain and France, over Prague's objections, sat down with Germany and Italy to resolve the Sudeten crisis. Prague wasn't even invited. On September 30, 1938, the Munich Agreement was signed, ceding the Sudetenland to Germany. German troops marched in September 1st to jubilant crowds. Heinlein had realized the dream of over 3 million Sudeten Germans. From the Czech perspective, the betrayal by the Allies and the failure of Sudeten German self-determination left deep scars. After Nazi rule ended, around 3.2 million Germans were expelled from the Sudetenland. 241,000 did not survive the expulsions. Heim ins Reich, return home to the Reich, became a bitterly ironic justification for the expulsion. For centuries, Germans and Czechs had shared Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia. How did things disintegrate so completely? Two core factors drove this: the breach between Sudeten Germans' expectations and reality. Denied affiliation with Austria Germany in 1919, they were thrust into minority status. Secondly, the Czech national concept of a homogeneous state after 1919, which in reality didn't exist. Given the demographic reality, the Czech concept of a national state was doomed. A federal system, somewhat akin to a reduced Austria, might have preserved unity, but Prague never implemented it. was fraught with realpolitik missteps and insensitive nationalism. Attempts to erase German culture through educational and language policies, dismissal of German civil servants, poorly planned agricultural reforms, and discriminatory neglect. All this pushed Sudeten Germans into isolation, socially and economically, and sowed the seeds for eventual political rupture. The SDP under Heinlein emerged not out of ideology, but simply from neglect and exclusion, as a reaction to Prague's failure to integrate its German minority and to address their suffering. This culminated in the Munich Crisis of 1938, and the story of Sudeten Germans remains a stark example of how failed minority and economic policies can escalate into international catastrophe.